He left her with frost in her hair and the memory of his boots fading into the white. Kieran Blackthorne's silhouette, receding like a verdict. She had been a small thing, ribs sharp beneath a threadbare shawl, eyes too bright with trust for a world that had taught him to harden his jaw. He remembers the sound she made when he stepped away. Not a cry, but a question braided with belief. And for a heartbeat, he almost turned back. He did not. Snow swallowed her shape and his choice, and the Ashvale Council witnessed his ruinous decision as proof of what an alpha must be: unyielding, unpitying, a knife that never trembled. He told himself then that mercy was a liability. He told himself that weakness left in the drift would not be allowed to rot the pack from within. He did not imagine that the weakness would return with teeth. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Mira Hale stepped over Ashvale's stone threshold like a winter storm that had learned courtship, precise, inevitable, and somehow beautiful in its ruin. The old archway smelled of smoke and old blood, and the iron tang of power. It smelled like everything she'd been denied. Her boots were clean, the leather dark with recent rain rather than the desperate mud of a child lost. She carried no shawl now. A hunter's cloak hung over one shoulder, and at her hip, wrapped in a strip of pale linen, a sleeping lump that breathed too small against the world. A hybrid pup, hair the color of wood smoke, and a whimper like a human's first cry caught between fangs. Mira's jaw was a map of lines he'd never been allowed to read when she was small. One at the mouth from biting back fear, another at the brow from a winter when a hand chose cruelty and called it necessity. Kieran saw her before anyone else did. That's the way alphas are made, senses carved about responsibility, a threadwire connection to the pack that flares at disruption. He felt the hair on his arms rise and a memory like iron pressed to bone. The council murmured, breaking like a tide as heads turned. Women who had once deemed mercy a currency for the weak glanced with quick, unreadable calculation. Betas who had sworn fealty clenched jaws. The matriarch who'd sat like a told star over Ashvale's throne lifted a hand as if to demand explanation. All of them waited on him to dissolve the apparition, or to acknowledge it and crush it without pity. Mira did not cower. She stepped past the council's carved benches as if she owned the floor beneath their feet. Her eyes sought him with that same impossible mix of accusation and something else. Hunger, maybe, or the ember of a question she'd carried for years. Why? He felt the question like frost in his chest.
There was a sound like a snapped twig as the pack released a breath all at once. Kieran met her at the center of the hall, where torches painted their faces with volatile light. He was built to be command. Broad shoulders, the hawk line of his jaw set into the familiar, unforgiving plane that had made him alpha. But when he looked at Mira, he felt he was suddenly the child in the drift again, the one who had chosen power over tenderness and convinced himself it was bravery. "You're alive," he said, the words smaller than the room. "You left me," Mira answered. Her voice was low, and yet everyone heard it, sharp as flint, soaked in the years when fear had turned to plan. The council leaned in like vultures sensing blood-new scandal. Kieran's chest tightened. He had built a life on a ledger of choices as clean and fixed as a blade. Admitting the incision had scarred him seemed a dangerous vulnerability for an alpha. He had reasons then, reasons layered in politics and fear, an ugly calculus that justified the cruelest of acts. An Omega pup might sour morale, invite predators, or signal softness in a council that valued lethal pragmatism. But saying so aloud would be to reveal a wound he had kept hidden beneath duty. He needed to hold authority like a torch, lest chaos smelled the smoke of hesitation. Mira didn't offer him the satisfaction of weeping. She pulled the small pup forward and set it gently on the stone, where it blinked awake, a human face tucked between wolfish ears. The room held its breath. Here in the heart of Ashvale, a forbidden thing slumbered and looked around, as if the world had always been a place where human and wolf could meet. "This is mine," Mira said. Her words were not a plea, they were a claim. 100 questions blossomed in the hall like frost flowers. Who had birthed this pup? Which human dared love a lichen enough to gamble blood and lineage? Rival packs watched them through whispers and narrow eyes. A hybrid meant scandal, and scandal was a currency everyone wanted to use. Kieran's council's faces sharpened into knives. For once he could see their hunger reflected in his own reflection. Men and women who equated power with denial of softness, who thought that governing meant making the impossible choices and wearing them like medals. In the crowd, Liz Arden, his fiercest beta, made a small disapproving noise. She had stood beside him through raids and negotiations. She knew the cost of an alpha's indulgence. Kieran felt her gaze like a stiletto. He had not chosen mercy then, and he would not be chosen now. Mira's eyes flicked to Liz, then back to Kieran. You told a pack once that whoever could not pull their dead from the line of fire would be left. That cruelty was the very thing that kept us alive. Her voice cracked, but she swallowed the split of it. You left a child.
There was no roar of accusation, only the quiet, bone-deep conclusion of someone who had measured every step of her life against that single abandonment. Kieran's throat worked. He had rehearsed apologies in the private hollow of his mind for years, always silenced by the twin obligations of image and legacy. He had been young, he told himself. He had been guided by counsel that preached survival at any cost. The truth, which had sat like a raw stone in his gut, was heavier. In that decision, he had tried to carve a path to respectability. He had become what the council demanded of him, and had lost something along the way. The pain of that loss had been private, folded under duty and denials. He felt the pack's eyes like coals. To admit guilt could unravel the very myth that kept Ashvale from gnawing itself apart. Mira watched him with a cruelty softened into something like pity. You were handsome, she said suddenly, and the observation landed like a thrown knife. Laughter, unused and brittle, caught at the edges of the room. Kieran's jaw tightened. You were cruel because you believed cruelty kept you safe, she continued. You were afraid of being human. Her face was an echo of herself, a young girl who had believed him. So you left me human. The wails of judgment from the council were subdued by a more immediate threat. Rumors always hunted in packs. If Mira's presence could be framed as a threat to Kieran's leadership, an opportunistic rival might pounce. Ashvale sat on a contested stretch of land where boundaries blurred with blood, and a scandal like this could kindle an entire war. Kieran's loyalty to the pack was a raw animal hunger. To protect it, he had to both crush the embarrassment and control the narrative. He had to appear indignant at being challenged, not flayed by guilt. He spoke then, and the words were steely, rehearsed. You show up with a hybrid in my hall, he said, voice cold as the winter he remembered. You offer no warning. You drag a scandal into our midst. For what? To provoke us. For a heartbeat, the room throbbed with the possibility that he would throw her out, banish the reminder of his youth the way he had once banished the trembling pup from his life. But the tilt in the council's whispers suggested otherwise. One faction favored a more public demonstration, a trial where they could both remind the pack of the price of scandal and assert that an alpha would not tolerate exceptions. Another murmured of leveraging the hybrid as a bargaining chip with rivals who would pay handsomely to see Ashvale bloodied. Kieran saw after only seconds the tight calculus of their scheming. It was the same cold arithmetic he had once used to justify leaving a child in the snow. The hypocrisy burned in him, black and blinding. Mira tilted her head, the motion so small and disarmingly human that Kieran felt his composure crack. I'm not here to start a war, she said. I am here for answers. For a reckoning. For the chance to learn why you left me, and what you intended when you decided that my life was less than the pack's reputation. There was splendor in her restraint, and for a second he imagined the naked ferocity she must have folded beneath civility to stand there unshaken. She had legs that had learned long miles, and hands calloused by survival. Her voice had the kind of steady cadence that belongs to people who have swallowed their fear and used it to sharpen their edge. Yet beneath her armor was the small, stubborn ember of the girl who had once trusted his hand. Kieran felt it like a vice, culpability and desire, an old map that led back to tenderness he had refused before. There was a dangerous magnetic pull between them that neither could ignore, the kind that makes old wounds ache into new claims. Outside, the first winter winds scraped at the stone. The hall's torches sputtered as if the air itself was holding its breath. In the silence, the puppy whined, a delicate bridge between the human and the lichen. Kieran looked down at it and, for the first time in years, the memory of another small, shivering weight in his arms rose up like a phantom. It was a ghost of that very winter,
a child, and Kieran felt the old, hot shame like a brand. The alpha in him bristled to defend his decisions, but another part, buried somewhere beneath training and blood ceremonies, wanted to step forward and undo what had been done. A difficult dilemma closed around him like a trap. To banish Mira would be to deny the truth of his past, and possibly to endanger a life that terrified him with its own existence. To accept her and the pup would be to expose the council to scandal and to reveal a softness that could fracture his authority. He stood in the eye of a storm of his own making, the old cut opened by Mira's return, and for the first time the role of alpha felt less like a crown and more like a chain he had forged himself. Outside, the moon rose thin and indifferent, promising nights where transformation would make everything feral and raw. Inside, two people who had once shared a winter of memory prepared to reconcile their power and their pain. The hall waited, and in that waiting was the seed of a war, of a romance, and of the reckoning neither of them could escape. The council tightened like a fist, and then relaxed, each member pivoting to the option that would preserve their little crowns. Discussion began in clipped, dangerous syllables, not the open shouting of a mob, but the slow, surgical exchange of people casting lines to see which way the current ran. Kieran listened because he had to, because the pack felt like a living thing inside him, and every opinion scraped his ribs. But Mira's presence undercut every rehearsal he had ever learned.
She was not merely an accusation. She was a living, breathing contradiction to the story he'd told himself in the long nights, that a leader must amputate softness, that an alpha might be defined by the cruelty he could summon and survive. Lys moved first. "We cannot allow hybrids," she said, plain and without flourish, the kind of sentence that belongs to people who believe rules are armor. They break lines, they attract human hunters, they muddy loyalty. If the rival Matilda hears— Her mouth closed on the hypothetical with the efficiency of a blade sheathed at the throat of a debate. The room slid toward agreement, a current that wanted to erase the anomaly and return the pack to neat, predictable hunger. Mira's hand tightened on the pup's linen wrap until her knuckles paled. "This child deserves better than your politics," she said, "and I deserve answers." She didn't beg for safety. She spoke as someone who had never expected the world to be safe, and therefore had learned to make herself so. Her stare pinned Lys like a token. "You can threaten me. You can brand me traitor or bastard or other, but you cannot parley over the bones of a child." It was Lys's turn to wince, not because Mira's words unsettled her authority, but because Kieran's jaw made a sound of near pain at the edge of the room. He had been taught to be an inflexible thing, but that inflexibility had always had a hairline fracture where Mira's name fit like a splinter. To Lys, it was infuriatingly human. To the council, it was weak. To Kieran, it was the island of private shame he had tried to deny existed. His reply was deliberate, the trained cadence of a man who knew how to hold a room. "You could have come to me," he said. "You could have asked for protection. You could have stayed hidden. Instead, you drag a scandal into the hall and accuse the pack." He stopped because the pack listened, and because there was a sting in his voice he could not disguise. If he sounded too guilty, they would seize on it. If he sounded too defensive, they would assume his guilt. "You are asking for more than a reckoning, Mira. You are asking for a disturbance none of us can afford." "That's a convenient defense," she said. And there was no malice, only the kind of cold arithmetic that mirrored his own. "You left me to prove yourself. You built a life on denial. I owe you nothing, Kieran, except the truth of how it felt to be thrown away." "Then tell it outside the hall," Lys snapped. "Let us—" "Outside," Mira repeated softly, and the word did something to the air. "Outside, you will kill me for the spectacle you crave." She looked at Kieran with an expression that mixed contempt and something that used to be a softer curiosity. She lifted her chin. "I want answers, not theater." The council stalled. There were rules for trials and more rules for exile, and more still for bargaining with rivals. Kieran could hear the weight of precedent settling into the rafters, and with it the knowledge that no matter what he decided now, consequences would gather like wolves at a lamb's pen. He could not afford another misstep where rivals sniffed weakness. He had made a covenant with Ashvale. His choices would keep them safe. But safety was a shape that could be contorted into cruelty as easily as bread into stone. He thought of the cold that had bitten into Mira's wrists the night he left, of the way one child had been swallowed by practicalities he had called necessity. He stepped closer to her, the distance measured and fatal. The pack felt the heat of him like a pressure wave. Alphas cut close when they intended to command. "We will do this properly," he said. His voice had iron woven into it. "There will be a discreet hearing. You will answer the council's questions. You will not parade this child in streets or courts." "I will not," he faltered, shockingly human, and then reinforced the sentence. "I will not have our enemies use this to turn us on each other." "For now," Mira said, "you speak of enemies that way because you need something to fight so you don't look at yourself." When she said the name he had heard in the drift, vulnerable, alone, there was no pity in it. "I want to know why you let me freeze. Not why you did it to prove a point, not why you followed orders, but why you chose me. Tell me who gave you permission to choose my nothingness." Kieran's mouth made a hard line. Answers were slippery things. Sometimes truth, sometimes a story shaped by the need to keep the pack whole. He could not say he had been cruel to prove himself, because that would erode the very ferocity they paid him to conjure. He could not say he had been terrified to show mercy, because fear would split the cultural spine of the pack. He could not say he had been a young man who trembled with the same doubts now gnawing at him. He could say none of those things honestly and remain alpha. He could also confess and risk the knife itself. "You want the truth?" he asked finally, the sentence like a blade laid on the table. "Then know this. I weighed the pack against that small life, and I chose the pack. I thought that would make us safer. I thought I was doing right." Mira's face did something like a map folding. "You saved your image," she said. "You saved the kind who would call themselves strong for killing what they consider weak. You saved your place." She let the sentence hang for what it was. "You did not save me." It was a wound that bled without being touched. Kieran felt that comment like a pressure under the sternum. He had been a boy in a man's insignia then, and perhaps he still bore the scratches of inexperience he'd never allowed himself to heal. Answering her would not undo the winter. It might not even move the council, but silence was a surrender to the story others would tell.
He took a breath that tasted of smoke and old iron. "I thought I was saving us," he repeated, smaller. "I thought a hard line made us respected. I thought I could not be both leader and soft." The words shook out, and the room felt the tremor like distant thunder. "I do not ask you to forgive me. I can only—" "You can't ask for forgiveness," Mira said, cutting him off, not unkindly. "Forgiveness requires acknowledgement and reparations. You can acknowledge whatever you like, Kieran, but reparations—" She glanced at the pup. "You have responsibilities that can keep him alive. That would be a start." The word reparations changed the angle of the room. Counselors who had argued for spectacle found themselves squirming. Who would benefit from a child's safety? Who would look like the villain if they turned down a practical way to avoid scandal? Kieran watched the calculations run like a shadow across faces he had long considered allies. Power is a currency that speaks in favors, and sudden opportunities to do the right thing, if one calls it that, often unwrap themselves into political capital. He felt the keen edge of being offered redemption by the same people who would sell him if it suited them. He thought of the pup's small chest rising and falling, of the human whimper at the edge of sleep. He thought of a girl with frost in her hair, and how easily memory had turned him into the villain he had tried to outrun. The alpha in him had been schooled in rulings that placed the pack's image above all else. The man in him, older and perhaps wiser, felt a different gravity. Trust had been broken between him and hundreds of souls that revered him, and he had the choice now to stitch that rupture or drive stakes through it. Outside the hall, a wolf howled, and the sound threaded through the ancient stones, unremarkable yet full of portent. The moon was a thin coin in the sky and would be round and glinting again soon. Transformation would bring rawness and hunger and unpredictability. It would make every choice of the day before a new negotiation against animal impulse. The clock of the moon made every decision urgent. Kieran knew rival Matillas would not wait politely for the council to sniff out a mutual comfort. The stakes were immediate. He made a decision in the way alphas do when necessary, quickly, while the pack's breath still hung in the room like a mist. "We will hold a hearing," he said, "but it will be different from what the council expects. It will not be a crucifixion. Mira, you will have the right to testify. You will have the right to call who you know to speak on your behalf. The council will decide on measures to protect that pup. We will set boundary protections while investigations proceed. Nothing." He stopped himself, the subtext loud and clumsy. "Nothing will be weaponized."
There was resistance. Patrons of tradition muttered, but Kieran had spoken with the authority of someone who could see the thinness of their old guard. It was an olive branch to the pack, or perhaps a tourniquet on a wound he feared would bleed him dry. Mira's eyes softened an inch in response, not a concession, but an appraisal. She had not come for kindness, she had come for answers and agency. This was neither fully victory nor defeat. It was something like being granted permission to remain and to speak. 100 small, dangerous gears engaged. Laius narrowed her eyes but did not openly oppose him. Others whispered about optics. A young beta suggested discreet patrols and quiet surveillance. As the council's machinery began to grind toward the scheduled hearing, Mira let out a breath so slight it might have been the wind. She handed the pup back to his linen wrap and looked at Kieran not with the childish adoration that had once fixed her to his choices, nor with the simple hatred of someone bruised and hardened, but with something more complicated, a calculation of possibility. "You could still be the man who leaves me," she said quietly. "You could still use this for show. You could still refuse the truth." "I could," he admitted. "And if I do, you will have the right to call me out. I will not stop you." There was a flicker of something like relief in her mouth. She had not come to be placated. She had come to reclaim agency, and part of agency was the ability to choose to trust with eyes open. "I will demand answers," she said, "and I will demand protection for this pup, not as a bargaining chip, but as a life." Kieran leaned forward, the motion charged. The room felt like a tight drum. He did not touch her. The ritual of hand to shoulder would have been read 1,000 ways. Instead, he lowered his voice so the council heard only the last part. "I have enemies who will use this," he said, "not a challenge, but a warning. If they strike, I will strike back. If you are to stay, you will not be alone." The promise was both threat and shelter. Mira's expression flickered between suspicion and something that resembled gratitude. The complexity of their shared past made their future an unstable thing, fragile and dangerous in equal measure. She stepped back, folding the pup closer to her chest, and the action read like a border being redrawn. Outside, a scout returned, and the distant hush of footsteps suggested watchers in the dark. Life at Ashvale did not pause, it only shifted. As the council prepared for the hearing, as alliances began to form and fracture in quiet corridors, the two of them stood in the half-light, two maps of pain and power folded and unfolding. The pack expected spectacle. The moon would demand bloody truth. Between the weight of old decisions and the pull of what might still be salvaged, Kieran and Mira held the fragile axis of something neither of them had the right to name aloud yet, the possibility that a wound could, if tended with care and danger alike, become the place where two lives braided together. For now, they had each other's presence, which was both peril and balm. The council's murmurs turned to preparations. Lys's eyes became a calculating glare lifted at him, and then away as allies sifted. Rival Metellus listened. Hunters tuned their ears. The world beyond their stone walls readied itself for the outcome of a decision that started with the most private kind of heartbreak, the kind an alpha made himself into a legend with no room for softness, and now threatened to become a test of whether power could learn humility. As the torches guttered and the cold pressed against the stones, the pup stirred and let out a tiny sound that was more human than wolf. It seemed, in that small breath, to demand a world that could hold both of its heritages. Kieran watched Mira with a new kind of attention that was not merely the alpha's assessment of threat, but the curiosity of someone who, late and chastened, might be willing to learn how to be different. "What do you want from me?" he asked, not fully sure whether he could accept the answer. "To be seen," she said simply, "and to be given the chance to show you what I became." The answer hung between them like a vow neither could yet understand. Outside, the moon braced itself for the nights ahead, and the pack, old, hungry, wary, shifted on its throne of stone, ready for the first law of wolves to be enforced:
survival, yes. But perhaps in the tender and bloody spaces between, something else might also stake a claim. The hall's murmurs had barely settled when the first blade of betrayal slipped between them. A scout burst in like a wintered thing, breath steaming, cloak whipped with the cold. "Borders," he said. "North Ridge, tracks, more than scouts. They come organized." His eyes were wide, the way eyes go when they have seen the face of a fate they were not meant to name aloud. The council erupted, torches flaring as if the flame could banish the threat. Names were spoken: rival Matila, incursion, a push to contest Ashvale's grazing lines. Kieran moved before thought had settled into the hall. Alpha instincts had taught wire. "Arm the borders," he ordered, voice ablade. "Beta teams take the North Ridge. No one leaves the hall unless on orders. Mira, stay." The last word was habit, but it landed on her like an old command. She did not flinch. Her hands tightened on the pup's linen wrap. The room became a map of readiness. Men and women who would be wolves within hours turned to steels in courts, and the ritual of blood and bone began to unwind into action. They spilled from the hall like a controlled avalanche. Kieran found Lyse at his side, eyes glittering with urgency.
"This is the distraction," she hissed. "Someone wants to split us. Internal scandal plus external strike. They want us scattered." Her suspicion was a hawk's talon. "If the hearing goes on now, it will be a slaughter." "I won't give them both," Kieran said. The word both was a rock in his mouth. One choice would make him look merciful, the other cruel. He knew, with the precise, cold knowledge of a man who has walked razor edges, what the rival pack wanted. To drag Ashvale into shame so they could claim the borders. To expose the Alpha as soft or corrupt and feast while the wound bled. Mira's voice cut through, small and metallic. "Why are they moving now?" she demanded. "We have had weeks of cold and no raids. Someone wants optics." A dangerous silence followed, and Kieran realized the question was not for strategy, but for accusation. He had, over the years, made deals for the pack's stability, quiet accords with nearby leaders, trade for silence, promises that saved men and wolves from needless bloodshed. Mostly, those deals had remained the thin thread between enemies, a nod, a boundary marker, a kept word. A few had required brutal compromises. One such pact, a winter's bargain set with a rival leader named Roar Calder, had been stitched into the ledger long before Mira's return. A pact Kieran now saw with cold clarity could be weaponized if anyone learned its terms. "You know enough to ask why they move," Liz said low. "We made peace, we traded grazing rights for a non-aggression on the border. If the rival Matilda thought we harbored a hybrid, then they would act," Mira finished. Her fingers trembled not with fear but with the echo of nights when she had fed herself on scraps and plans. "They could use this as pretext. They could claim we broke the pact." Kieran's gut dropped. The pact with Rourke had been secret precisely because it conceded ground, literal and moral, and because its terms meant acquiescing to things the council would never sanction openly. He had argued in a room of weary elders that the price of peace was small compared to the cost of war. He had agreed to patrol limits, to watch one valley fall into the rival's control. He had sworn to never speak of it. He had done it with the weight of survival heavy on his tongue. He had never intended for the secret to break their backs or to become the rope that strangled them. "Who told them?" he demanded. It was a raw question because whoever had leaked the pact had not only threatened Ashvale's borders, they had exposed Kieran's most guarded compromise. If the council discovered the deal, their trust in his blood would crack like thin ice. Eyes turned like knives. A whisper drifted behind Liz. Someone in the council had always held a grudge. Names grazed the edge of language. Kieran felt that ancient private fear, betrayal from within. He had not merely wronged a child once. Now he might find himself undone by a conspiracy he had never seen forming.
Mira's jaw worked. Or someone wanted to make sure the two things happened together, attack and exposure, so the pack would be too busy to defend a pup. Her bitterness tasted of metal and remembered cold. "You think you keep secrets for peace, Kieran. Maybe some people keep secrets for leverage." The accusation was a splinter aimed at him. Kieran's eyes narrowed. He could feel the council's gaze like vultures, each with its own hunger for confirmation. Lysa's voice cut through the clamor. "We secure the borders. We hold the hall. After we conduct the hearing in private. No leaks." Her order was a dam on panic. For a moment, Ashvale thrummed like a single heart preparing to fight. They moved as wolves move, fast, economical, lethal in their efficiency. Kieran found himself leading a sortie that would hold the ridge while betas and scouts readied traps and ambushes. Mira wanted to go with him. She was denied by Lice, a political refusal hidden in concern. "You stay," Lice insisted. "You are evidence now." Her eyes were fired brass. "If you die on the ridge, Mira, the council will call for war outright." Mira's mouth shaped a curse and then closed on it. She handed the pup to someone she trusted, a healer from her clandestine past, a woman named Jessa who had tended broken shoulders and sharper things with the same gentle brutality. "Do not parade him," Mira told the woman, "and do not take him where councils speak loud." Then, as Kieran stepped toward the door, Mira's voice stopped him. "If this is a trap meant to show I chose the wrong allies," she said softly, "then know this. I did not choose Rourke. I did not choose any of this. I chose survival." Kieran's chest convulsed. He wanted to ask who she had allied with, who had given her arms and swords and knowledge enough to return to Ashvale not as a child, but as a blade. He wanted answers, though he knew some would tear him raw. He set his hand on the hilting of his decision. "Watch yourselves," he said. "If Rourke moves, he will find himself facing a pack not bent on spectacle, but on blood. And if this betrayal came from within—" He did not finish. The sentence hung, heavy as an unspoken threat. Hours became a sharpening of nerves. Scouts called warnings that braided across the ridge. Figures moved in practiced arcs, not the ragged chaos of desperate raiders, but the rehearsed precision of a force with a plan. Rourke's sigil was not there. He had no reason to risk direct command if he preferred a knife in the dark. But patterns revealed themselves. This was an orchestrated push intended as more display than conquest. Kieran's teeth ached with an old, private contempt. A war of images was worse than a war of swords when one's image was the commodity that held a fragile piece together. When the confrontation came, it felt like watching a wound open in slow motion. The rival Matilia's vanguard met Ashvale scouts in a glen already scored by frost.
Words were thrown like offerings. Surrender, recount your king, explain your moral failings. Someone shouted the word hybrid, and the air curdled. A lunge followed. Blood sang the same song beneath both feet. It was not a pitched massacre, but a brutal, choreographed reminder of what power could do when prodded. Kieran was a man trained in the choreography of violence. He moved with a neat, terrible grace, closing distance and breaking the line where the rivals had tried to cleave his pack in two. For all his practiced cruelty, when he heard the shout of a friend, he realized the betrayal had teeth. A man from his own hunting party, a young beta named Emmer, had been struck down not by a rival blade, but by a skewer of treachery that came from behind. Someone in Emmer's own unit had turned and driven a hand dagger into his throat. The attacker wore the colors of Ashvale. Kieran stopped, as if a hand had pulled his spine. Siege and battle and negotiations folded inward until the single, unbearable truth uncloaked itself. The enemy within was not merely a rumor. Someone in his own ranks had sold them out. The Matilla Ridge had smuggled blades into the pack by ways Kieran thought sealed. He felt it like a physical ache, the deep betrayal of being undone by the very people whose faces he had traced into the history he carried like a map. In the chaos, Mira found him. Smoke and blood, hair wild beneath her hood, eyes lit with a wrath that was not entirely surprise. She moved through the fight as if she had danced these steps with death before. For the first time since her arrival, she was not a claim, but a presence that fit. The sight of her covered in other people's blood, some enemy, some traitor, punctured Kieran with contradictions. He wanted to gather her into the same kind of shelter he had once refused to offer a child. He wanted to be both alpha and atonement. He could not be both easily. They fought side by side without touch, a brutal intimacy that said they understood one another's edges well enough to avoid them. Yet after the last of the scuffle, under a sky that had shifted from coin to gash, Mira dragged Kieran away from the center where the dead and dying were sorted like bad memories. There, among overturned carts and the metallic scent of blood, she spoke in a voice that shook not with anger, but with fracture. "You knew," she said plainly. "You've kept a rope around their necks and called it peace. Who else knows? Who else treats human-like in life like a line item you decide to erase when it's inconvenient?" Kieran's jaw trembled. "I kept it to save this pack," he insisted. "I thought—" "You thought what?" she demanded. "That your decisions gave you the right to choose the value of a life, that you could weigh a pup's breath against your reputation and call it neutral?" He had no answer. He felt the sting of someone else's blade, his own, rake across his hidden truths. "I thought I could keep us alive," he said finally.
I thought the cost would be smaller than the alternative. Mira's eyes were feral. And the cost was me, she said. We are nothing if not the sum of costs, Kieran. But you never taught us to measure what wasn't useful to the ledger. You never taught us to measure the lives you sacrificed for your great peace. Her words were a fissure that rippled through him. He realized that even as he fought to keep the pack whole, he had built walls so high they hid the faces of those he damned to the drift. He had made choices that preserved borders, but refused to reckon with the bodies of those decisions when they came walking back to stand in his hall. The fracture widened when Liz found them. She had blood on her knuckles and a decision like a blade. "This will cost us," she said, not unkindly, but with the pragmatic cruelty of someone who saw the council as a machine to be kept running. "Rourke will press. There will be demands. If it is discovered you hit a pact that conceded land, they will call for a trial of your leadership." Kieran's world narrowed to a pinpoint of cold comprehension. His secret, the bargain he had cut in the dark, could unseat him. The very thing he had meant to use as a cushion against war might become the lever his enemies pushed to topple him. The realization felt like falling. Mira's expression shifted, not entirely unsympathetic. "You can cut your losses," she said with terrible clarity. "Save what you can of your myth." Her voice was not a plea. "Or you can admit it and let the pack choose whether to keep an alpha who bartered away their land." He looked at her, at the girl he had left, at the woman who had never forgiven him, and now had the moral advantage of a wound he could no longer hide from. The hall, the battle, the pall of betrayal, none of it offered clean edges. He had created the circumstances that led to this fracture, secrets piled upon compromises, all designed to keep a fragile peace. Now the consequence had the face of the child in Mira's arms. He had to choose between preserving the thin, invented image he had been sculpted into and the ragged, wounding truth that might ruin him, but honor the lives that had never had a vote. The choice felt less like power and more like a surrender of an armor that had once seemed necessary. "I will call the council," he said finally, the words leaving him like a surrender and a plea. "Public records. I will lay out the pact. I will explain my reasons. I will risk what must be risked to show the truth." There was stunned silence. A cold wind moved across the ridge like a hand running over an old scar. Liz's face made an expression that could have been grief or calculation. Mira's gaze did not soften into gratitude. It hardened into something like appraisal. "That will not be enough," she said. "People measure with simpler tools. Your admission will be met with knives, even if it is honest."
"I know," he answered, "but I do not want to build anything more on the backs of those I betrayed." She listened to that. For a long, hungered beat, she looked at him as if measuring the sincerity like a new bite. The pack's fractures would not close easily. The council's trust might evaporate. The rival Matilda might seize the opportunity to press until Ashvale bled. There would be consequences, and perhaps the pack would spit him out as a poor leader who had once chosen wrong. Mira wrapped the pup tighter to her chest and stepped back. "I will attend your hearing," she said, "but I will not let any of you pretend the kid is a pawn. I will not let you bargain with his life." Kieran wanted to move to her, to bridge the distance that had become a canyon of years and choices. He did not. Instead, he nodded, the motion small and full of the weight of the man he was learning to become. "Then we speak the truth," he said, "and after, whatever comes, we own it." She left then, quietly, not storming, but with the kind of calm a person carries when they have been through winter and know how to keep their heart from cracking. The council reconvened into a strange, trembling order. The ridge settled back into watchfulness. The dead were tended, and the traitors were taken from the field, bound for trials that would test the pack's blood and resolve. As night folded itself over Ashvale, and the moonless sky reflected the bruise of the day, Kieran found himself alone in the hall where he had once left a child to die. He sat where torches threw long shadows and felt the weight of a secret pact like an iron collar. He had chosen to reveal it, maybe the only honest choice left, but the decision had not made the path ahead any less jagged.
Outside, the faint echo of wolves howled in the dark, and in the distance a different howl answered back, one born on the breath of a rival pack. The fracture had widened. The truth would come like winter storm or thaw. He could not say which. But Kieran knew now that power without admission was brittle. Whatever the cost, if he hoped to keep anything of the pack he loved, he had to let the wound be seen. And somewhere, in the shadow of the trees, Mira watched the hall's torches and held the pup against her, listening to the bones of the pack creak. She had returned for answers and found instead a decision that could remap a people. Her trust was not healed, her rage was not dulled. But there was a small, inarticulate thing like possibility lodged somewhere near the place where anger and memory met. She had not come to be saved, she had come to be seen. If Kieran could not provide all the answers she needed, she would shape them herself. The night closed around Ashvale, and the choices laid themselves out like trail markers. The fractures sang, the secrets had bared their teeth.
And between two people who had once shared a winter of small mercy and unthinkable cruelty, the space between them, once frozen and sealed, had cracked into something raw and dangerous, ready to be either mended or widened by the hands of those who would finally tell the truth. They hauled the council into the open court at first light, torches guttering like wounded things as the pack gathered on the stone terraces. Kieran posted guards at every entrance, then walked to the center, with the limp, heavy thing of his secret folding like a kept confession in his chest. He had decided to lay the pact bare. He had chosen to be the scandal that might shatter him, rather than let another life be used as leverage. Mira came with him, the pup wrapped against her breast, eyes hooded and fierce. She had not softened. Only the lines around her mouth carried a new sort of calculation, the one people learn when they mean to keep a promise to themselves, rather than to anyone else. The council squinted and shifted. Rivals watched from the tree lines, hungry for the show. Lice stood flanking Kieran, brass-faced and unwilling to offer him pity even now. Kieran spoke first, voice steadier than he felt. He unrolled the ledger of his own shame. Names, terms, the valley they had ceded, the men he had paid with territory rather than with blood. He did not offer excuses. He offered context and consequence, and a plain admission that he had weighed this pack's future against a child, and had erred. The words landed like stones. Some faces curdled toward fury, others softened with the aching wisdom of those who have seen leaders break. "Tell them what you promised," Mira said quietly when Kieran faltered. Her voice cut through the hall, not a demand but a tether. He looked at her, not the girl with frost in her hair, but a woman who had hard-won mastery of herself, and in that look something inside him unspooled. He told them the rest, what the pact had cost in land, in hunts, in silence. He meant to accept the consequences of the truth. Before the council could decide, the attackers came, not from the ridge as before, but from the dark grain of trees, Rourke's wolves, sharp and sudden, throwing themselves at the terraces to turn the hearing into carnage. The rival leader stepped forward, a grin like a blade. "You admit your bargains," he called, voice carrying. "Good. Now watch the cost of such bargains." He gestured, and the assault began. Chaos shredded the speeches. Ashvale's defenders leaped into a choreography learned in blood. Kieran moved like a man who had rehearsed for this his whole life. He fought through the press to a point where a striker aimed for the pup. Time slowed. A shadowed hand lunged. Mira's grip tightened. The world narrowed to the pup's high, fragile cry. Kieran threw himself between the attacker and the child. The blade found him in the ribs, a clean, hot pain that stole his breath. He collapsed, and the pup cried out in a way that Mira's head tilted like a struck animal. For a moment he saw the old winter tilt back into place, him carrying a child he had once abandoned, now being carried by consequence. He clutched the wound and tasted iron. Mira's world narrowed to that single bleeding point. She moved with a violence that was not theatrical but elemental. The wolf in her surged, not to rend the enemy, but to protect what was still small and human in her arms. She launched herself at the man whose knife had found the alpha. Her teeth found his throat in a flash that was both animal and precise, a bite that unseated him in a way the council's verdict never could. He gurgled and fell. Around them the fight rerouted,
stunned by the sudden, feral justice of a woman with a pup. She turned then, blood at her mouth, eyes that had become bright and terrible. For the first time in years, she let him see the rawness underneath her armor. Kieran's breath came rasped and shallow. He could have been angry at the wound, the embarrassment, the leverage his enemies thought they'd seized, but seeing her by his side, lethal and unwavering, one feeling rose and made itself large. Gratitude that had the shape of something a man could not hide in the face of vulnerability. "You should have come for me," she said low, not asking, more a carved fact. Her fingers, calloused, sure, pressed at his wound with a healer's knowledge and a lover's possessiveness. The motion was intimate and terrifying and true. "I left," he managed. The word was small and full of a confession saved for the moment between life and death. "I know. I paid for it too late." Around them, the fight lost its momentum. Ashvale's wolves had rallied. The invaders faltered when they realized the pack was no single machine to be pried apart. The rival leader, seeing his advantage crumble, peeled back into the trees like a bruise retreating. The terraces stank of blood and victory's cost. Lice cut down a final pursuer and strode to them with a face split between fury and reluctant respect. Mira did not withdraw from Kieran, though her hands trembled where they worked. She pressed her forehead to him in a small, human gesture that said more than words. He felt it like thaw. The wound in his ribs panged, and he smiled with the foolishness of someone who had been allowed mercy he did not think he deserved. "You bled for us," Mira whispered, the admission carrying a weight she had rarely afforded any man. "And you bled for me," he answered, fingers finding the side of her face, feeling salt and grit and the pulse of living heat. She laughed, the sound of brittle, bright thing. "I came back with answers," she said, "and with a mouth that can take what you thought would always be yours, your control."
He reached for her then, not to command but to claim, and this time his hand sought consent in the tremor of her palm. The council murmured as Lice called for healers, and the pack arranged the wounded. Kieran's wound would scar. His place might be forfeit someday. He had exposed the ledger and invited judgment. But the trade had been made. For his honesty, he had Mira beside him, lethal and uncompromising, refusing to let his old armor be the only language between them. Under the raw, widening sky, they held one another in a world made of wounds and vows. The sacrificial act, his admission, her blood, had shifted the balance. Where once power had demanded hardness, now it demanded repair and reckoning. Mira's teeth had proved stronger than his doctrine. Kieran's chosen vulnerability had cracked open a possibility no council ritual ever permitted. When healers lifted the pup to safety and the dead were counted, Kieran found himself watching her, feeling something like relief and something like awe. "Stay," he said, not an order, but a request that trembled with new currency. She looked at him, eyes holding a map of winters and hard miles. "I will, if you let me be more than a wound in your ledger," she replied, "if you let me stand where I choose." He nodded. The night had taken his iron and returned him with an ache that could not be called weakness. He had traded an intact image for an honest ruin, and in that ruin, something like a new foundation began to be laid. Not power over others, but power shared and earned. The moon began to roll from its thin coin into a face full and inevitable. As the pack gathered the scattered, as council prepared for truths and punishments, two figures, one bleeding, one fierce, both newly leveled by the same truth, stood close enough to feel the heat of each other's breath. Between them, the promise of something dangerous and tender unfurled, that love could be the force that reshaped power, and that a wound tended by both could become a claim neither could ever unmake. They carried the wounded into the warmth while dawn bled pale across the terraces. The hearing that would have been spectacle became something harsher and truer, a reckoning. Kieran laid the pact bare, took the council's judgment, and accepted penalties that cost him land and prestige but kept lives intact. Those he'd betrayed were given restitution. The hybrid pup, named Ash by the healer who cradled him, was granted sanctuary under Ashvale's watch. The council fractured, some bowed out, others learned a new, awkward humility. Mira stayed, not as a prize or a token, but as a sentinel at Kieran's shoulder. They forged a new compact. She would lead a ward protecting hybrids and humans, and he would rebuild boundaries with honesty.
Where once his authority had been a chain, it became a shared responsibility. Her bite beside his bite, equal and fierce.
That evening, under a moon grown round and generous, they walked the ridge together. Mira's hand found his, not to be guided, but to mark the place she had chosen. He squeezed, and in that pressure, human and wolf, the scar between them softened into a promise. They would tend the wound together.